And on behalf of our audience, I want to thank my guests, Luis Santiago, Matt Flynn, and Orville Pitts. And as always, I've enjoyed being your host. I'm Dave Foran, and I invite you to join with us again next month for our program on human rights.
Human Rights is produced by the Milwaukee Human Relations Radio Television Council. If you have a topic you'd like to have discussed on this program, please send your suggestion to Human Rights, Box 444, Milwaukee, Wisconsin 53201. This was a public affairs presentation of WTMJ Incorporated.
You're in touch with 94 FM, WKTI Milwaukee.
This is Howard Cosell for the ABC Contemporary Radio Network. The name of the show is Speaking of Everything. My guest is a distinguished writer, a columnist for the New York Daily News and the New Yorker, and he has written a book about a segment of the population. Calls it the underclass, the estimated 9 million Americans who, because of unshakable poverty or chronic antisocial behavior, function outside the mainstream of society. My guest's name is Ken Auletta. His book was published by Vintage Books. And Ken has been with us before because he wrote a book previously called The Streets Are Paved with Gold. And he is acutely aware, having served at one time in the cabinet, in effect, of the former mayor of New York City, John Fleet Lindsay. He is acutely aware of the problems of the great urban areas of this country and of the group that he calls the underclass. Now, what is the underclass by definition as you see it, Ken?
There are about 30-some-odd million Americans who are classified as poor, living in poverty. The underclass comprise about a third of that poverty population. They're not just poor. Some of them, in fact, are quite wealthy, some of the career criminals who comprise the underclass. What sets the underclass apart is behavior. That is to say, we're talking about a group of Americans who operate outside of organized society, are either hostile to society as we know it, or afraid of society. And the underclass generally, it seems to me, fall into four categories of people who most concern Americans, by the way. One of the career criminals I just mentioned. These are people who go into a life of crime the way I go into a life of writing. A second group are the hustlers, the people who operate in the underground economy, generally not violent. They're the pimps, the prostitutes, maybe the drug runners and pushers. A third group, the dependent poor, the passive poor, the long-term welfare recipients, the 40% of women on welfare who've been on welfare at least 3 years or more. And the last group, the fourth group, a group that has become much more prominent in the last few years, and that's the homeless, the traumatized, the people who many of whom would have been in mental institutions before we adopted this policy some years ago of deinstitutionalization, the drunks, the shopping bag ladies, the people who were traumatized. Those four groups comprise the underclass, and what unites those four groups is behavior. That is to say, they operate outside of commonly accepted values.
Okay, that sets it forth pretty well. Now, tell me about the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, which you worked on for 7 months. I'm leading up to the fact that its funding died on December 13, 1981. But first, tell me about the corporation.
I went around and I asked people who had worked with poverty a number of years, what is the best organization you know of in the United States that deals with the hardcore unemployed? I didn't have the phrase the underclass at that point. And a number of people suggested the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, which was funded by the Ford Foundation and the federal government beginning in 1975 with a different kind of a mission. They were not only going to run experimental programs around the country for the hardcore unemployed, but they were going to do something that is not done in government, which is they were going to do a research component to try and find out what worked and why. And they were only interested in experimenting. So they were doing, at the time I came to them, 5 experiments around the country, including an experiment in 21 localities, both rural and urban, among whites, among blacks, among Hispanics, something called supported work. And I went to school for 7 months, enrolled in a supported work program in New York City at the Wildcat Skills Training Center with 26 individuals, and to be eligible for this class, they had to have just gotten out of prison for a felony, been an ex-drug addict in the treatment program, a long-term welfare recipient, or delinquent youth. Not skimming. This is a pretty hardcore group of Americans. And for 7 months, I went to their training school with them and attended a class, particularly called Life Skills, taught by a former welfare cheat and felon by the name of Howard Smith, who basically was teaching them not just the reading and writing and typing skills that they got in their other classes, but basically life skills. How to behave, how to cash a check. I remember the first Friday I went to the bank with them, and these people, by and large, had never been in the bank except to rob it. And they walked in that bank, and they were frightened. And the amazing thing about it was the customers in this bank, it was in the garment district in New York, the customers all turned and looked at these people with these afros and different dress. And the customers and the tellers were quite frightened. What they didn't realize was that these 26 individuals walking in this bank for the first time were more frightened of them and of being in a bank. They didn't know what to do, how to stand on a line, how to say please or thank you, how to endorse a check. And so what Howard Smith, their teacher, was trying to teach them was how to do that, how to do things that we take for granted, work an alarm clock, dress for work, go out on a job interview, say please and thank you, appear to work on time. And again, we go back to the behavior component of this group, of this element of poverty, which is how to behave and operate in a normal society. Work is not normal for the underclass.
What a remarkable recital, Ken. Again, Ken Auletta, the writer, our guest, author of The Underclass. But as I noted in my lead question to you that brought forth that exposition by you, on December 13, 1981, the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation lost all of its funding. Are there any other comparable organizations now operating in the United States?
There are small efforts that amount to throwing pebbles in the ocean of this problem. Operating the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, for instance, still is in operation on a much scaled-down version. Supported Work, which was in operation in 1980 in 21 localities, is now in operation in about 9. Supported not with federal funds, but with city, state, and usually philanthropic, privately raised funds. Still operating on a scaled-down version. Since the Reagan people have come in, these efforts, which were never vast to begin with, that is, say, targeted efforts that this group called the Underclass, have been reduced substantially. The problem, this is not just true of the Reagan administration, it was true of the Carter administration, before that the Ford administration, and the Nixon administration, and the Johnson administration.
Now, earlier in our conversation, you touched upon all of the people who constitute the underclass, your definition of it, and the fact that it included rural people, too. Now, is there much rural community awareness to the problem of the homeless, for instance?
The homeless takes a different form in a rural community. First of all, the numbers you deal with in a New York or Detroit or Los Angeles are so much more vast than they are in Morgantown, West Virginia, where I spent some time. So the problem is not as pervasive. I found that the problems of the homeless or the problems of the violent career criminal are much less in a rural setting than in an urban setting. However, what is common, for instance, to the white underclass of West Virginia, let's say in Appalachia, to Harlem in New York, or Watts in L.A., is this generation of women for whom welfare becomes a way of life. That is to say, in West Virginia, in the program there, Supported Work, their biggest problem in recruiting women, these were white women who had been on welfare for a long period of time. The average length of time on welfare in Morgantown, West Virginia, was 6 years. And they found that 25% of the women they tried to enroll in their Supported Work program would not join the program, even though they were promised more money than they got from welfare. And the reason they wouldn't, the largest reason they wouldn't, is they were afraid to leave the security of their home and their soap operas in the afternoon for the insecurity of a check in the world of work.
Is there any way of breaking the underclass into the mainstream of society? Is there any logical, practical way
I break the problem down into three schools of thought. One school of thought is the traditional left liberal view, which I call the wholesale school. And actually it's a school that Ronald Reagan in the campaign of 80 and Jack Kemp in the campaign of 80 also subscribed to, which was basically say that what we need, the left liberal will say we need a Marshall Plan, a domestic Marshall Plan to spend money and to put everyone to work. And the wholesale conservative like Reagan in the 80 campaign or Jack Kemp says what we have to do is get government out of the way, give tax incentives to businesses, reduce taxes, and private sector will solve the problem. Both of those views, which seems to me make the same common assumption, which is that the problem is economic. That's false, I think. I think the problem is behavioral. The other school of thought on the other extreme is what I call the laissez-faire school. Edward Banfield at Harvard, Thomas Sowell, a black economist at Stanford, subscribed to it, and that's basically that there's very little you could do, get out of the way, and it's their fault. All you can do is police the problem with law and order. It seems to me that approach ignores the success that programs like Supported Work have had with people enrolled, which gets to the middle position, which it seems to me is a realistic one, and yet it doesn't promise a panacea. And that's what I call the retail approach. That's to say that the 21 communities that Supported Work was tried in, other programs, I just came this morning doing a column on teenage mothers, a program for teenage mothers that the YWCA is running in New York City for 100 mothers. Those small-scale efforts that provide individual attention are not very expensive, but also not very dramatic. They don't promise, it's not a touchdown pass. These are grinding out 1, 2, 3 yards at a time.
Like the Giants.
Depressingly so, yes.
But that's your basic conclusion. That's the approach you like.
The approach, I think, I prefer a wholesale approach, but in my heart I prefer it, but I don't think it's rational.
Yeah. Or worked.
Nor can we afford it.
Well, how much should the government be committed to the problem of the underclass? There should be some governmental commitment, don't you think?
Well, absolutely. You cannot do it. If you start from the assumption that this group of Americans are outside our system as we know it, and require a tremendous amount of behavioral training and habit training, it's very expensive, and no private enterprise is going to undertake that on their own. Only government, which is not just concerned about efficiency, but is also concerned about values and a better society, a more equal and just society. Only government will put up that kind of money, be it state, local, or federal government. Government has an essential role in doing this. But what you also learn is that the big programs, the big centralized efforts, where there's no individual attention, where people feel like they're working for bureaucracy, where participants feel as if they are working for the government, and therefore it's like the civil service, we have a guaranteed job. Well, therefore it becomes like welfare. That tends not to work. Supported Work, they found, for instance, that the jobs in the private sector that were subsidized, the participants did much better in those than they did in government jobs, because in the private sector, the people running it were concerned about the bottom line, and therefore were tougher on them, and therefore they had a sense in many cases that the people cared more about them than they did in this anonymous, vast government bureaucracy. But I think government has an essential role, which it's abdicating, in my judgment, right now.
All right. Why has the problem of the urban ghetto been essentially ignored by the feminist movement?
Interesting question. If you look at what is happening in our society today, I can't think of, outside of the question of nuclear war and peace, and what to do about the national economy, I can't think of a problem that's more important and affects more people than the underclass. They are disproportionately responsible for the crime that burdens every resident of America. They're disproportionately responsible for welfare, for the arson and the graffiti and the fear that haunts our streets. And so the public is really concerned about it, and government is not as concerned about targeting this group of Americans. And when you look at then what causes this underclass, one of the chief causes, which is ignored particularly by feminists, is the breakup of the family. That is to say, if you go to Central Harlem, not very far from the studio, 77% of all the children born last year in Central Harlem, mostly black children, were born out of wedlock, no father in the house. Nationally, 55% of all black children in America are born out of wedlock, without a father in the house. So you're talking about whereas in 1940, the percentage was only 15%.